We should be clear, I guess, that we're speaking a bit loosely about agencies and helping us find a surrogate, that the law in Canada is such that agencies are not allowed to match you to a specific person. And they don't do that, but they facilitate you finding each other. And each consulting company might do that in a very different way. So we ended up working with two different companies and they both worked slightly differently. But, it's funny, Marta, you talk about the day that Daniel and I met, and we talked about finding a surrogate a little bit like dating. Like
A
to say,
lot of people
no,
say that.
there's no perfect surrogate out there, just like there's no perfect intended parent out there, right? We all come to a fertility journey with our own stories, our own journey. Everybody is different. And so a lot of it's being perfect for each other, finding that person who's for you.
Hi, superhumans. I'm Dr. Mavis Garcia.
And I'm Dr. Wise.
We're two of the physician leaders at Markham Fertility Center, otherwise known as Our Baby, MFC.
As fertility specialists, we've witnessed firsthand the challenges, triumphs, and the myriad of emotions that come with trying to conceive. Whether you're just starting to think about having a baby, actively trying, or facing challenges along the way, My Fertility Podcast will be your go-to resource for honest conversations and a supportive community.
So grab a cup of coffee or tea and settle in, and let's demystify the world of fertility together.
In light of Pride Month, June 2024, we're going to be joined by a same-sex male couple talking about their fertility journey, touching on subjects about donor egg as well as gestational carriers. I am so excited today to be joined by two of my very, very good friends, two very old friends of mine, Jason and Daniel, who are going to talk about their own particular fertility journey. Jason and I went to medical school together and we've known each other forever. And I have to say, I still remember, Jason, you coming home after your first date with Daniel, you being a little coy in terms of how well it went. But I knew there was something special there. And so seeing you guys now with your family and your two children is absolutely a beautiful thing. And so I'm so glad to have you on the podcast so that we can talk about your fertility journey. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us. I
Thank you.
forgot that, Marta. You were there the day that we met. I forgot.
I was. I know the whole story. I know all the dirt. Yeah.
That's really special. Thanks so much for being here, Jason and Daniel.
Thank you for having us. We love your podcast. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So why don't you start by telling us about your family and start telling us about your journey towards starting a family?
Yeah. So, as a same sex couple, I think we always knew that starting a family, we were going to need a little bit of help. And our journey started in 2017 and in the end lasted about 7 years. I always tell people there were four incredibly wonderful, generous women who helped us to start our family, in addition to, of course, the fertility specialists that we worked with. So it was a long journey. We've come a long ways, but we now have two daughters. Our older daughter, Sydney, is turning 4 tomorrow, actually. And our younger daughter, Dylan, is now 6 months old.
That's amazing.
That's really incredible. At the point where you were starting to think about building your family, starting to think about potentially having children together, where did you start?
I guess we probably started at first deciding whether we wanted to do surrogacy or adoption. And so we kind of looked into both options, ultimately decided on surrogacy. And so we started looking into the different agencies to help us out. I know there are a lot of folks who kind of go at it alone, but we felt like, especially the first time around, we needed some guidance to help us through the process and to help us find a surrogate and to help us with egg donation and all that kind of stuff. And so at the time, there was really only 3 major agencies in Ontario that you could work with. And so we looked into each of them and we settled on one of them and kind of away we went.
And then how did you ended up working with a fertility clinic to find an egg donor?
The clinic was basically recommended to us by the surrogacy agency, and they seemed good and they were. And so we used them. And with an egg donor, it was also through the surrogacy agency that we worked with the first time around. So for our first daughter, they had kind of a sister company that did egg donation. So we just worked with that company as well.
Do you ever consider using a gestational carrier or a surrogate from the US or from abroad? Because that's a question that comes up a lot, I think, for patients.
Yeah, we didn't end up getting to that as a consideration. I think our thought process was we were going to start with Canadian options first, and that we were very lucky that that ended up going very well. And so that we didn't end up being further afield. But I know that that is something a lot of people think about. There's a lot of considerations when it comes to cost, also just arrangements in terms of legal arrangements when you're working with more than one country.
How did you find the process of matching with a surrogate in the first place? And did you have a surrogate ready to go before you pursue the egg donor? What was the timeline for
Yeah.
that?
We didn't. Some people have people in their lives who are, the right person to be their egg donor or their surrogate. And I mean, we have wonderful people in our lives, but we just didn't have that person in our lives. And so we knew we were going to have to find someone. And that I think most people follow the order of finding an egg donor and creating embryos first, and then move on to finding a surrogate. And so that's the order that we went in.
We were actually given advice, I believe, at the time that most surrogates want you to have egg embryos
That's right.
created already because usually once they've signed up with an agency, they're kind of ready to go and they don't want to wait, however long it takes to make embryos.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's why I asked the question because you had mentioned you started with a surrogacy agency. So I thought that was curious because you're right. For anybody listening, the ideal situation, if you don't have, like you're saying, somebody in your life who's just waiting for you, is to find an egg donor, create the embryos, and then have those embryos available when you start talking to a surrogate. So that makes sense. So once you had your embryos made, what was it like to match with a surrogate? Were there a lot of difficulties with the match? Did it take a long time? Did you have a lot of, people that said maybe, but not quite were ready to commit? What was that experience like?
Yeah, we should be clear, I guess, that we're speaking a bit loosely about agencies and helping us find a surrogate. That the law in Canada is such that agencies are not allowed to match you to a specific person. And they don't do that, but they facilitate you finding each other. And each consulting company might do that in a very different way. So we ended up working with two different companies and they both worked slightly differently. But, it's funny, Marta, you talk about the day that Daniel and I met, and we talked about finding a surrogate a little bit like dating. Like
A
to say,
lot of people
no,
say that.
there's no perfect surrogate out there, just like there's no perfect intended parent out there, right? We all come to a fertility journey with our own stories, our own journey. Everybody is different. And so a lot of it's being perfect for each other, finding that person who's for you. And so you're in a situation of trying to get to know somebody in a fairly intimate way quite quickly, which is a lot like dating. And, that requires you to be very honest about who you are and what you need from the relationship, but also what you're able to give and what you're hoping from that partnership.
When you're trying to build your family through surrogacy or egg donation, or even just IVF, using your own eggs or your own sperm, it brings out conversations that many people who just meet and, have sex and get pregnant the next month don't need to have, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what are some of those things that you would have never thought about that you needed to think about when you're talking to a surrogate?
When you start talking with the surrogate, it's just about getting to know each other, right? You just want to know who you are and what makes you tick and what makes you happy and what your family is like. And it's like dating, you're just getting to know each other. But then very quickly, if it's going well, I think you get into some fairly personal and fairly deep questions. There's a lot of things in surrogacy that you can predict, right? You know that you're going to have conversations about how many embryos do we transfer, how many rounds of IVF are we going to try. There's things you can predict, but there's a lot of things you can't predict. What if there's a major complication along the way? What if there's a situation in which there's a risk of harm to the surrogate's body? There's a lot of situations you can't predict, but you do need to have some conversations about that in advance so that you can all be prepared and be on the same page to tackle those challenges when they happen.
Was there anything that helped you facilitate that conversation, like certain resources? How do you know what you don't know to talk about, I guess, is the question, right? That's always a challenge.
Like Jason said, there are a number of things that you can predict, and that's how kind of you start those conversations. A lot of the conversations were also facilitated through the contract making process, because the surrogacy contract is pretty thorough and it talks about all the things that Jason was talking about. It talks about under what situation would you have an abortion, and then it goes down to granular things like what foods should the pregnant person not be eating and that kind of stuff. And so that's where you kind of can drill down. And it's important, I think, to have a good, or at least an experienced lawyer for both sides so that they can think about those things and ask you questions that you wouldn't necessarily know to ask.
But I think you're absolutely right that you can't predict everything that's going to come up. And so I think a lot of the process of talking with the surrogate, I haven't mentioned their names yet. Our surrogates were Heather and Carla, and we just think we won the lottery twice over. They were just so amazing and are just incredible. You know, they're part of our family now. But one of the things that we discovered with both of them during the process was that we had good communication. And that, I think, was just the fundamental bedrock that you need going into this, because you can't cover every possible situation. So you need to make sure that you have a relationship where you can communicate effectively. You can be honest about, you know, everybody's needs and opinions and values. And so that when the unexpected happens, you have that basis to be able to tackle it together.
That makes sense. It's a huge leap of faith. I mean, it's kind of like you're saying, it's like dating, Jason. Then you have a relationship, a partnership, hopefully for life. With surrogacy, it's almost the same in a way. I mean, they're carrying your child, they're caring for your child for 9 months. And then, like you're saying, you have a relationship with them.
Absolutely. And both Heather and Carla, our surrogates, have families. They have partners and they have children. And our second time, we had a child as well. So it's a dating process, but it's a dating process between families. It was really important for Carla and Heather that their partners also were on board and felt comfortable with us. It was important for them that their kids were on board and invested in the process.
I have been involved in many surrogacy journeys, and I'm fascinated by that relationship. And when it works well, it's beautiful. It really is a beautiful thing. Of course, we all hear the stories when it doesn't work out well and there is miscommunication and misconceptions and things like that. But it can really be a wonderful experience for everybody involved. I know many of the surrogates that I've worked with just absolutely love their intended parents' families and the journey and the relationship that they have with them.
I'm still kind of blown away after all these years that there are people out there who are willing
Right?
to do this for complete strangers. And it's wild. And we're so grateful to both Carla and Heather. And I'm sure that every intended parent feels that way as well.
Can you guys speak a little bit to the timelines? Because I think that for a lot of same sex male couples who are contemplating a similar fertility journey, I would venture to say that one of the things that surprises them is certainly the timelines and how long things take. Can you speak a bit to that?
Sure. The rate limiting step is probably going to be the surrogacy matching process. So once you kind of settle, if you want to use an agency, once you've settled on an agency, get the ball rolling with that as soon as possible. And then you can make your embryos while you're waiting to be matched. We use 2 different agencies. The length of time it takes completely depends upon how many surrogates there are and how many intended parents there are. First time around, the agency quoted us 2 years from the time we signed them until the time we would match with somebody. And we kind of thought like, okay, we're a pretty eligible couple. People are going to like us. It's going to take shorter than 2 years, right? But it actually took 2 years for us to match. So it was good that they told us that that's how long it was going to take. And we had kind of started maybe a little bit earlier than we were ready to actually have a kid. With the second agency, it was a bit of a different process. They were less hands-on in terms of facilitating the match, which meant that it was basically like a dating website where surrogates would put profiles up and then the intended parents would basically bombard them with emails. We talked to Heather, who's the surrogacy we matched with through the second agency, and she said that she put a profile up and she would get 50 emails within minutes. And so,
Wow.
so we actually matched pretty quickly, I'd say within maybe 4 or 5 months of signing up with that second agency, but that was really fortunate. So I think that's uncommon. We must have had a profile that spoke to Heather and, we hit it off with her. So it's a long process. And then even after you've matched and you have your embryos, there's still the screening process that needs to take place. And then there's all sorts of other medical steps that I'm sure you have much more expertise on than we do that need to take place before you can have an embryo transfer. And then, of course, there's no guarantee that the transfer is going to be successful the first time around. We were not successful the first time around with our second pregnancy. So it can be a long, like Jason said, 2017. So from the time we signed up to surrogacy, from the time we sat down and said, okay, we're going to have a family, until the birth of our second daughter, where our family is complete, right? And that's, over 6 years.
I think that's a really, really important point, because working with same-sex male couple patients, the surrogacy agency might say, okay, 2 years to match. So they think, okay, 2 years and then we'll have a baby. It's like, well, no, not quite. Then there's the medical delays, legal delays, something happens within the surrogate's life and suddenly she needs to delay for a few months. I can think of one case where we were going to pursue the egg donor, but then the egg donor broke her leg and then that set things back. And so there are so many moving parts and so many people involved that can really extend out the time, unfortunately. And I think that starting earlier and then setting that expectation in terms of that multi-year process truly is so important.
Can we talk a little bit about the experience of now your surrogate is pregnant and there are OB appointments and she's having symptoms and she's feeling the baby kick and the delivery room, she goes into labor. How were you able to get involved in the pregnancy? How do you remain connected to the baby from that perspective? Did you find your care was inclusive of your situation with your obstetricians? I'd be interested to hear that side of your story.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, we talk about it being a really long journey, and it is. And there are really high points, and there are challenging points. For us, the pregnancy part was the fun part. That was where the quote unquote work of getting the legal matters and the medical matters was largely done. And we were at that point just really excited to be pregnant. I think that how involved you get is one of the things that you talk about with your surrogate in advance to make sure that you're both on the same page about what that involvement's going to look like. And, we wanted to be as involved as we possibly could with both of our surrogates. They lived quite far away from us, not a drive, but a plane ride away. And so we had
Okay.
to pick and choose financially where we could be involved. That both Heather and Carla were really wonderful about Skyping us into appointments with the OB. We would come down for certain really important ultrasounds like the anatomy scan and just involving us in the little parts of pregnancy too, I'm having a craving for this today. And there's those fun things about pregnancy that we wanted to be part of. Yeah, when it came to the delivery, I mean, surrogacy is relatively new. And I think thankfully there's a lot of experience building in Canada. But when we went through it, we weren't entirely sure how the hospitals were going to handle it and what the experience was going to be. But I think we were extremely pleasantly surprised that the hospitals were very accommodating, did wonderful things to make us feel very welcome and to make it understood right from the beginning that we were the parents of the baby and we're making decisions for the baby right away. It's the little
Mhm.
things that stick with you. They have these little birth cards for the baby after they're born, and the birth cards are pre-printed with the forms that would be written in there. And then you would write in the parents' names and the baby's name and the date of birth and all that. But the pre-printed form had father and mother printed on it. And we didn't even notice in the hospital that we had a new baby. We weren't paying attention to that little card. But I noticed just weeks later that they had taken white out to the mother part and written in father in there,
That's
paying
wonderful.
attention to the smallest little details. And we were just so grateful for that. At the same time, providing really amazing care for our surrogates too. Let's be honest, they were doing all the heavy lifting at that point. And the hospitals were really just wonderful with them as well.
I'm so happy to hear you had a good experience. Here, I've done deliveries with surrogates and two fathers intended parents or a heterosexual couple intended parents. And sometimes when it's a C-section, there's only so many people that can be in the room. Sometimes the surrogate wants her partner because that's the person that she's comfortable supporting her. So there's sometimes a situation there, but yeah, I think it can be done really well and keeping everyone safe and everybody comfortable if you really put your mind to it. Absolutely. I'm happy to hear that you had a good
Similar
experience.
to really any birth, I think, every birth people go into it with an idea of really what they would like the birth to be like, but unexpected things happen and you have to be ready to adjust. And I think the same is true for surrogate births, that you have to have conversations in advance about how you're hoping it's going to go and what the plan is, but at the same time, you have to go into it ready to adapt.
Yeah, I think that holds true for absolutely every single birth for sure. I'm curious, what was the most unexpected challenge that you guys faced as you went through this whole process? What was the thing that surprised you?
We haven't talked about choosing an egg donor, and I would say that that was surprisingly difficult. It's one of these things that, on the one hand, it feels like one of the most important decisions you'll ever make. Depending on where you feel land in the nature versus nurture spectrum, 50% of the genetics of your child could be very, very important. And so it feels like such an important decision. And on the other hand, it feels so arbitrary. You think about the various things that people might think about in terms of how somebody looks, their interests, their education, what they do for a living, all of these categories that at the same time feel like very arbitrary. Like, should we be really looking at these things for our child? That just feels very strange. We found that actually surprisingly difficult to do.
You talked about surrogacy and connecting and getting to know her and all the things, but for an egg donor, there is none of that. I don't know what was your situation in an egg donor, but many times it's anonymous. You're looking at a profile on the internet. You never meet them. You never get a sense of who they are as
Mhm.
humans. And so there is a huge contrast. There's a person who's carrying your child but not providing genetics, and you are so connected to her. And then there is a person who's providing 50% of the genetics, not carrying your child. And the system is set up that there's really not a lot of connection between intended parents and donors. How
Mhm.
does that feel?
Yeah, it's a bit funny that there's these two people out there who share half their DNA with our two daughters, and we're never going to meet them, and they're never going to meet them. One thing we did is we sent flowers to the clinic where the egg extraction was happening on the day that it happened, as our way of saying thank you, even though it's somebody that we're never going to meet and never actually be able to fully thank them for the contribution they've made to our lives. But yeah, it's weird. It's weird.
And I think especially for our daughters, we share with them about their birth story, everything, of course, to the level of their developmental understanding. But for them, I think it's something they're going to really wonder about and want to know more. And what the agencies have told us, that they could potentially reach out to the egg donor agency at some point and see if a connection is possible. But yeah, it's something that I'm sure they'll ask us more questions about. We kept, of course, the full profiles for our egg donors and all the pictures that we could get and every scrap of information that we could get. And we have that ready to give to our daughters when it's the right moment. And fertility counselor said to us as well, write down your thought process about choosing the egg donor almost as a letter to your child about how you made this decision that would impact the rest of their lives. I thought that was good advice because you want to be able to share with your children everything you do know about where their genes come from.
That's a fantastic suggestion, actually. I haven't heard that before, but I think that that's really quite brilliant.
Absolutely. I sent an email to a patient yesterday. She's in a heterosexual couple, but she needs an egg donor. So her donor cycle, and I sent an email saying, I'm very happy, great cycle. You did great. She's like, I'm saving that email for my donor box that I'm going to give my child. And I was like, oh, that's great. I mean, what a wonderful sort of legacy to give to your child to say, this is what happened. This is how we got here.
A good surprise. So part of the process, of course, is you need to meet with a fertility counselor who's doing an evaluation to make sure that you are fit to make a decision about entering into surrogacy. And we felt initially like, oh, this is a hoop we need to jump through. This is a barrier we need to get over. It was maybe a little kind of annoying that we had to do this, but it was actually a really valuable session. It was now 6 years ago, and I still remember word for word some of the things that our counselor shared with us during that session. It was just so helpful. I encourage anyone going through the process to make use of those sessions because they're actually great.
I am so glad that you touched on that because that is one of the things that we talk about here all the time. Anybody using gamete donors, if you're heterosexual, using an egg donor or sperm donor, if you're a single woman using a sperm donor, if you're same sex male using egg and surrogacy, sometimes it can feel a little punitive because people say, well, if I was Joe Smith and Jane Smith off the street, I wouldn't have to be having this conversation. But the goal is not to be punitive or to even say you're good enough to be a parent. It's just to, exactly like you said, to help you think about things that you wouldn't have thought otherwise, help you ask the right questions, or think about concepts like how are you going to tell the child? What kind of information do you want to keep that you normally wouldn't think otherwise? And you're right, many people go into that appointment quite annoyed and they come back with that feedback, exactly that you said, like, wow, that was great and helpful. And it would have never occurred to me to have this conversation had I not met with a fertility counselor. They're very experienced. They see lots of different stories, lots of different perspectives, and it can really help people using gamete donors or surrogates sort of open their eyes to things that are not obvious. They're not obvious unless you're there having that experience.
It's so funny. I was going to say the exact same thing.
Well, I said it first.
Yeah. No, but I mean, like, that's our experience, right? On
Mhm.
the end of telling people or suggesting this to people, or it's actually mandatory, right? But patients get this like look of fear or a bit of annoyance in their eyes. You're like, no, no, like, trust me, this is, it's going to be good. I promise it's going to work. So hearing you guys say that is really, really fantastic.
One of your daughters is very young. She's only 6 months, right? So you're probably not having conversations with her other than goo, 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 goo. But the 4-year-old, how is that going? How are you introducing the concept of an egg donor and surrogate? And what kind of questions is she asking? What is that experience like?
And we kind of taken the approach from the beginning that we're going to be completely open and upfront and honest with her and with both of them about, where they come from and who helped create them. And from a very young age, she knew that our 4-year-old, Sydney, knew that she spent 9 months in Carla's tummy. And she knows that daddy and dada drove across the country in the middle of a pandemic to meet her for the first time. And those conversations get a little more sophisticated as she gets older. I mean, she's still too young to understand the ins and outs of egg donation and surrogacy and that kind of thing. But yeah, when you introduce these things from a young age or open with your kids about it from the beginning, it just is their reality and it's neither here nor there. And she knows that she has this wonderful person in her life who kept her safe for 9 months. And Dylan will learn the same thing when she's a little bit older. And we think that was the approach that worked best for us, I would say.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And all the research actually supports that.
Yeah.
Not the same. I have my children conceived through IVF right at this clinic at Market Fertility Center. And it's not the same level of complexity, but I've told them from day one, yes, mama's eggs, daddy's sperm, but it was made in a clinic, in a lab, because mama couldn't do it on her own. And they still come to work and they're like, can we go and see what we were made? Which is still at the lab over there. They love coming here and they love having that special story to their stories.
Great resources these days too. The sex education books that are coming out, and they're a lot more inclusive. But yeah, kids are very accepting. It's like we were having a conversation with Sydney the other day. She was asked, I wonder if I'll have children. And we asked her, would you like to have children when you're older? She's 4, mind you. And she said, yeah, I think I would. I'll speak to Carla or Heather. And in her reality, that's where babies come from. That's Carla and Heather.
That's sweet.
very cute.
I mean, obviously, this has been a very long process for you guys, and I can only begin to imagine in terms of how challenging it may have been. So, how did you guys support each other through the ups and downs of this journey that the two of you went through?
Jason bakes.
And you eat the
You know
cake.
what? I,
We
you know,
baked
that is,
sweets.
to me, that is actually a complete answer because, as Daniel knows, Jason and I lived together one summer. It was 4 or 5 months. And there were a lot of emotional ups and downs during that summer. And yeah, Jason baked. And I just remember sitting around eating Jason's baked goods and everything was fine. That's a very, very clear statement. I think I gained like 10, 15 pounds that summer, to be clear.
Sometimes I say that tongue in cheek, but it is also kind of true. I don't know how you feel, but having an open communication with your partner, just like you do with your surrogate, is really important through that process, and talking about your things that you're excited about or that you're nervous about or that you're feeling anxious about or whatever is important to be able to support each other. I mean, I guess those are kind of for any relationship, not even just partner relationships, but I think that's true certainly when you're going through the surrogacy process.
Did you share that you were going through things publicly with your friends, your family, with social media, or did you keep it private?
Yeah, we decided to just be very open with our family and close friends. Neither of us are super active on social media, so we weren't sharing a lot there, but no, it wasn't a decision not to. I think it's different for every person. Some people really benefit from their privacy and from being able to not have others intruding into their personal journey. But at the same time, some people benefit from having the support of people knowing what they're going through. And that's how we felt. I think we wanted our families to know what we were going through so that we could share with them and rely on them for support. And we had a number of failed transfers, a number of times where we lost the pregnancy at an early stage. And for us, having family support at that point was just really helpful.
And in terms of social media, I think that's also something that's important to communicate with your surrogate about, because some surrogates will not want that kind of information public. And conversely, some surrogates actually really do want you to post on social media, we're 5 months pregnant and here's our wonderful surrogate who's helping us along this journey. Communication is key in that respect.
I would like to ask you, having been through 7 years and having completed your family, what advice would you give to somebody who is starting out on this journey?
Don't be forlorn. I remember when we first started, and like Jason said, we had a few failed transfers. You'd walk around on the street and you'd see other parents with babies and strollers, and you'd be like, how is it even possible that babies are made? Like when you're in high school, they tell you how easy it is to get pregnant. They never tell you how hard it is to get pregnant. So and you feel like this is just never going to happen. And I think we both kind of went through that despair phase, certainly the first time around, but even maybe the second time around too. And I mean, we are fortunate to live in a time and a place where there are a lot of resources available. Some of them are expensive, unfortunately, but there are resources available to folks who are having trouble getting pregnant. And just know that nothing in life is guaranteed. It can and likely will happen for you. It just takes time.
I would answer the question by saying, know who you are and be true to yourself. When you're going through a process like this, there's so many people involved. You end up talking to lots of specialists and you're working with your surrogate and their family. And it's always kind of tempting to put on a face persona. You want to give the best version of yourself, but it's such an intimate, difficult process that's not going to last, right? You won't be able to hold that up. And so you really need to know who you are, be honest with yourself, be true to yourself, and just be yourself through the process, because the faster you can get to that and be honest, the easier it's going to be.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
And, it's so interesting because we started this conversation talking about the breadth of different experiences that happen in fertility and in infertility journeys, and how we want to try and showcase all the different facets of fertility and infertility. But what you said, Danielle, was so universal, right? And we hear that from so many patients, like that moment of despair and that moment of, oh my God, how does anyone ever get pregnant? And it's such a universal thing and such a universal feeling that I think every patient coming through fertility feels at some point, I would venture. That's so interesting, just the universality of it.
Thank you so much, Jason and Daniel, for being so generous with your time and your insights and sharing with so much honesty and vulnerability. And I'm sure our listeners are really appreciating it too.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for making the podcast. We love it.
Thank you. And honestly, when we started this podcast, you guys were at the top of my list in terms of guests that I wanted to invite, because I think that it's been a long journey, but you guys have your happy ending. And I think that that's such a beautiful thing. And I love being able to show that to people and to patients who may be in those moments of despair that you talked about earlier, that you're right, like you can get there, even if it is maybe a long journey, even if it is going to have its ups and downs. And so thank you so much.
And I have to admit, Marta knows Jason's baking and Daniel knows Jason's baking, but I'm the only one in here that has not experienced Jason's baking. So I'm feeling a little bit left out. We need to correct that at some
And I
point.
haven't seen your wonderful clinic, so it sounds like sometime I need to come up and do a tour and bring something along for you then.
Okay.
And that's a wrap for today, Superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast, or visit us online at myconfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episode.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss. Music from Mix Kit Raising Me Higher by Ajay Stalino. My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice, nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.